and out of focus. Here's your host, Sam Zervitz.
Hello again. This is Sam Zervitz. This is In and Out of Focus. Thank you very much, Tally Olson. And today's subject is kind of a difficult one to pin down. It's a subject we all think about. It's a subject we live in. It's a subject that's part and parcel of our very being. It's history. History is changing even as we live it. The past is changing. The present is very hard to get a grasp of. And we're curious about history. We're curious about our personal history. Our personal history has become a product. History is not quite a history as we think of it. It's become a possession. It's become a claimant's proving ground almost. It's a weapon of sorts. My history, your history. Then we have Ancestry.com. We have Alex Haley's Roots that came out in the 70s as a literary and genealogical phenomenon. We have history that becomes very personal. We have history that tells us where we are and possibly even where we're going. I have a family tree, and my family tree goes back to the 16th century, and I'll talk about that maybe a little later. But it's history, how it's taught and how it's learned. And one of my favorite books, it's always been one of my favorite books, and I've talked about it in a different context. It's called Leibowitz's Canticle, The Canticle of Leibowitz, and a writer named Miller wrote this book as a satire. And the satire was, in the not-too-distant future, there is a nuclear holocaust, and the only people left are nuns on a vigil. And one of the nuns, and they don't know what happened before because the nuclear holocaust pretty well wiped out history as anyone knew it. And the desire, it's almost like the Rosetta Stone, reading the Rosetta Stone, to find out what the ancient Egyptians thought and how they conducted their lives. So this, actually, I guess he's whatever he is. He's a monk. Monks. Did I say nuns? I meant monks. This monk is on a vigil, and he belongs to a certain sect, and they're the survivors. And the monk on this vigil is digging around, and he finds under a rock a little sack with some artifacts in it and a note. And the note says something to the effect. It's like a shopping list, only he doesn't know it because he doesn't recognize anything on it. But the note says 6 rolls, half a pound of bologna, a jar of mustard, a jar of pickles, and it's signed Leibowitz. And immediately he thinks he's discovered, like the Rosetta Stone, this monk thinks he's discovered in his vigil what happened in the past that no one knew about. So this monk and then all the people who come after him study this for the next hundreds and hundreds of years to try to argue. They debate it and they argue about it. What happened before? And it's something that becomes, they call it the Canticle. And even in history as we know it now, as it's being taught now, as we're processing it now, in my mind, it's got to create a generation gap with what parents and grandparents learned and how, and what's currently being taught to children. And I learned simplistically enough, we were the good guys and the other people were the bad guys. And I went through all of that, starting with 1776 and the War for Independence and the British and all the other things, and the War of 1812 and the Civil War and the Spanish-American War and World War I and World War II and all the rest of it. Anyway, but there was never any question, and then all of a sudden there became questions. And we need to know we need to know personally, and we need to know globally where we came from, how we gravitated from there to here over the years and the centuries. And it's a part of the human condition. The curiosity of it is a part of the human condition. How it's taught is something else. And that's what I'm going to get to, because there are several waves here that I want to ride as they crest in our time. And one of them is political correctness, one of them is historical revisionism, and one of them is just history as it was, and interpretive history, I guess, as it became in academic circles. And if I'm looking for a word, a single word, a term to sum up what I'm going to wax on, wax off about, it's reality. Reality. Can we depend on history? Could we ever depend on history to give us a sense of reality, a sense of the real, as in this is what really happened, and so forth? Anyway, it's a reality check. How do we know about ourselves and our world as it was, and as it is, and as it maybe will be based on what came before it? And of course, there's the staid and classic and often repeated statement by Santayana that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And we're certainly living in a time when it seems like we haven't learned very much. And we certainly appear to be doomed to repeat something here, and I'll go into that a little bit later too. And these are dangerous, treacherous areas to deal with because, as I said, history is a weapon now. History is a claimant's weapon. My history, I got it first. I was there first. That's mine. And there's a lot of that going on, and it isn't being resolved easily, and there are no courts of historical accuracy. I mean, you can say that Native Americans were this, and you can say that Jewish people in the Middle East were that, and Arabs were the other, and so forth. And it's the somewhere, the source. We seek the source. The source is all things to the claimant. It's critical. And you might say the source is the portal to our brains, where this knowledge and information and even the junk mail seeps in. And it's a mix and match, a hybrid of ideas and images that come and go, that become for us historical accuracy. But how do we know the history we're learning is accurate? Because in the mix comes something that I've got people here who will claim, and they're knowledgeable people, and they're experts on history, and they're experts on other things. And I've got two people I'm going to go into in detail who are very smart people, who will tell you political correctness has skewered our reality because we don't know about political correctness except that we're told it may not be accurate, but at least it won't offend somebody. And do we avoid being offensive at the expense of the real? Which leads us to the larger question, would you rather have? And in any history course, this question has to sit at the top when you're dealing with it. Would you rather have the real, or would you rather have the polite? And if polite isn't real, which one are we leaning toward? And how do we know what is real anymore once we've skewered the real for everything and anything in a more polite venue? Anyway, what I got, and what I want to talk about, how did I learn history? How did you learn history? How did anybody learn history from a certain age back? And I said it was generational. What I received early on, I didn't get historical, I didn't get revisionism, and I didn't get political correctness. I got straight up. And I want to borrow now. I want to do something. We all, of a certain age, grew up with a program on TV, and Rod Sterling, the great Rod Sterling, with his introduction, his haunting intros to the Twilight Zone. And I've got my own intro to this. And I haven't got the voice, of course, but I've got the tone, the inclination, and the Rod Sterlingness of it. We are in a time and place where just because you've read it, just because you've seen it, doesn't mean it's what you thought it was. There are influential voices everywhere challenging what you've perceived, reminding you, warning you, it is or isn't so. You are lost in a journey, a guidepost of others serving your perceived nonsense. Is it or isn't not so because you've seen it, heard it, touched it, or because your reality is delivered to you daily at your door? It's packaged from a parcel service, welcoming you to the outer directed world of counter-reality, where the only certainty is uncertainty. Welcome to this Twilight Zone. And that's my Rod Sterling. Not very good, but I tried. But that voice, you can remember it and actually hear that voice in your head. Anyway, there's a comic bit here that I wanted to add that fits perfectly because a lot of our reality comes out of other sources, and one of the sources is, of course, the UN. So this is a little bit of UN humor. We're told the UN has attempted a worldwide single-question survey. And the survey is one question: would you please give your honest opinion about a solution to the food shortage in the rest of the world? So the survey becomes, according to this little quip, the survey becomes a complete failure because in Eastern Europe nobody knows what honest means, in Western Europe nobody knows what shortage means, in China nobody knows what opinion means, and in South America no one knows what please means. In the United States no one knows what the rest of the world means. Anyway, that pretty much sums up what I'm getting at here in a little bit of a jaundiced way. Maybe the first time ever I took note of this struggle. It's kind of an entanglement to get the label, the name right, to be least offensive, to be most appealing, was in my educational circles. We had 100,000 children in that school system. 20,000 of them were deemed special. Well, they were deemed different things, but they were exceptional. They were exceptional. They were special. Anyway, so it was called early on special education. And the 20,000 children were special ed children. Then they became exceptional. Then they became impaired. Then they became special needs. Then they became challenged. And this depended on some category of physical, emotional, or intellectual impairment that was measurable on the other side of a certain line called normal. But they were part of a process, and this process eventually, where they were separated from the other children, and that wasn't good because we had a law, 94-142, that said they've got to be part of the other children's learning process. So we mainstreamed them. And then I don't know what happened to mainstreaming, but somebody changed that to inclusion. So we included them. So we keep changing the titles and changing the designations here, and I don't know why or how, because I don't see any of them being any less or more offensive than any of the others in some politically correct circumstance. And I really want to talk about politically correct because politically correct has changed the game forevermore. And the latest anyway, if you came into that special ed area and you didn't designate from the latest designation, that was a bad thing because somebody would jump on you and say, no, they're not exceptional, they're impaired, or they're not special needs, they're challenged. And then that became something else. So in this little corner of the planet, we're going to attempt, and probably fail, to look at, to study, to make any sense out of linguistic changes in vogue in numbers of areas in our culture, our society. And at least one person that I've researched for this says we are living in an age of ideology, and political correctness is nothing if not ideology. And when it becomes law, that's when we've got real problems. Right now, it's become, in polite circles, what you say and what you don't say. And you can get in trouble if you say the wrong thing. How much trouble is where we're leading to. Anyway, make the most expedient decision in whether we go with historical accuracy or political correctness. That's what I wanted to know. And that's what I want to know what you think about. Because if we fail, even while we wonder what's next or fix on what we think of it, the change will in our time become for us the only certainty. It's going to change. The language is changing every day. We need a politically correct dictionary now. We need a politically correct thesaurus now. Changes abound from day to day, week to week, year to year. Where did they come from? Who decides? The language of choice. How do we manage to keep up without offending somebody? If you don't know, is it like the law? If you don't know the law, that's not an excuse. If you don't know the language, is that an excuse? Who changed it? My father. And I've talked often in these broadcasts about my father. My father wasn't, of course, in his time in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 30s, when he was at his optimum. wasn't tuned into language. But in the he was a pharmacist. What did he know about language? He knew how to put a label on a bottle, take 2 pills 3 times a day, whatever, or take 3 pills 2 times a day, or 1 pill 4 times a day. Anyway, but he saw labeling. He was, since the majority of his consumer base was African American, and not called African American at the time, but called some things that weren't all that pleasant. He saw, and he really was a most compassionate, sensitive, and understanding of men, because it was his living, and because he really genuinely enjoyed being in that population and working with that population and making things better in his way, health-wise and otherwise. In that drugstore. That drugstore was his world. He had control over that drugstore. He could make the world better. But he didn't like he knew what stereotyping was. If he didn't have the word, he knew it. He knew it was accusatory. And there's this editor of the local paper, and I remember his name, William Schmick. Schmick was the editor. And whenever the paper at the time had some storyline about a criminal or an accused criminal or an alleged criminal of a given race, they editorialized it by putting in the headline the name of the race and the name of the person, or the name of the race primarily. And my father saw that as the meaning an entire race based on so-and-so. If so-and-so did something wrong and so-and-so were identified by race, that was wrong. So he wrote this William Schmick a letter, and in a short time, I think he got a reply back, and in a short time, and he took credit for it, but nobody knew where it came from. Suddenly the Sun paper wasn't putting the race of the criminal as an identifying factor in its stories, because of course it had nothing to do with the crime or the story, but they identified that way. Then, in my own instance, in the school system as a public information officer, I started to notice that when a kid from a high school across town or on the North Pole or wherever that kid was did something that was questionable, that was criminal, that was problematic in that time and place, and this was in the 70s and 80s, they identified that child, that as usually a high schooler or a middle schooler who did something, and it could have been horrendous. It was maybe a horrendous act, a terrible act, a criminal act, but they identified him by the school, and it would be so-and-so school student, robbed somebody, or so-and-so school student caught in a drug this. And I made it a note to try to get them to take the name of the school out of the article, because the school didn't do it. The child did it, and the school didn't do it, but they invariably would put the name in the headline of the school, which meant the entire school, and in a larger fashion, the school system was responsible. So mine wasn't changed. It was never changed. But my father did get him. My father did have a victory of sorts. No one knew it, but and no one knew that he had reached this editor, Schmick. And no one knew that the names, that suddenly the Sun paper wasn't printing along with the name of along with the offense, the name of the group. But, and then I resented later when I used to see in the same paper, so-and-so a Jew, or the Jews have done this, or the Jews have said that. And I am, after all, Jewish, and I hadn't done or said it, but somehow or other I was included. And if it were a negative piece, I were included in the negative aspect of it. The Israelis do this, Jews do that, so-and-so says this. I didn't think that was fair either. I didn't think it was fair in any context that in any identifiable way a group was was called to task because one of its members did something that made the news, and in not necessarily a favorably way. My father was proud of what he did. I couldn't get what I thought anywhere near getting it successfully corrected. Anyway, so changes, revision. Changes are changes, revision is revision. Some for the good, some not so good. And here's something that just came up, and I think this is what triggered this whole thing off for me pretty much. This is and Bible. I mean, Bible I thought was sacrosanct. You can't change Bible. The Old Testament is the Old Testament. Adam is Adam, Eve is Eve, Cain is Cain, Abel is Abel, Moses is Moses, David is David, Solomon is Solomon, Saul is Saul, Abraham is Abraham, Isaac is Isaac. But here comes change. Somebody, somewhere in another faith determined, and everybody knows, who knows anything about the Old Testament knows, at some point Abraham was told or ordered by the Almighty to take Isaac up on the mountain and sacrifice Isaac. Not good. And it was a test. And of course Isaac was never sacrificed. It was a test to see if Abraham would listen to the Almighty's word and do what he were told to do. And it was a test, and everything worked out, fortunately. And Sarah didn't say anything, and Isaac was okay. Now, and then in our faith, an animal sacrificed. It's a test of loyalty, and an animal was sacrificed at that time, and I don't know if they're still doing anything of that note except in extreme Orthodox circles. But reality, and here's reality. Now we have another claim on Abraham and Isaac. And this is the first biblical revisionism I've come in contact with in my lifetime, where the claim is, and it's another faith. And I won't go into this or belabor it because it wouldn't be politically correct either, but that faith claims it wasn't Abraham and Isaac. It was Abraham and Ishmael. And it didn't happen on a mountain nearby. It happened in Mecca. And it's Ishmael. And that faith has a holiday called Eld. And I never heard of Eld. And apparently Eld happens, and they celebrate Eld. Now, that faith wants to have Eld, and it wants to, if the date is arbitrary, they're going to have it on September the 11th. They're going to celebrate Abraham and Ishmael and September the 11th. And celebrate it. And celebrating anything September the 11th is not a good thing, because nobody is celebrating 9/11 except them. And they're going to be celebrating here, there, and everywhere, because it's been apparently part of what they want to do this year is celebrate. So people, I'm reading this, and I'm reading people around the New York, New Jersey area are not going to be happy if that particular faith is celebrating in or around 9/11. And they're celebrating Eld, and they're claiming Ishmael went up on the mountain with Abraham, and it happened in Mecca. So you can change a lot of things, but or you can try to change a lot of things. But this is consistent. I mean, leave the Old Testament alone. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove most of this stuff. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove the people were the people then. The events were the events then. The miracles maybe were the miracles then, and so forth. And I think the Dead Sea Scrolls should speak for themselves. I think the Old Testament should speak for itself. And this is the first time in my life that I've ever heard anybody trying to change any of this, which is consistent already with a biblical change for the sake of appeasement that has Israelis certainly upset, because suddenly they're hearing that the Western Wall isn't the Western Wall anymore. It's somebody else's wall. And that Hebron, and we visited Hebron when we were in Israel last in 1968. Hebron isn't the Israelis, the prophets' Hebron. It's somebody else's Hebron, and they've changed the name, and the names of it are being changed. And it's being somebody else's. And you can't pick and choose, I don't think, biblical sites and holy sites and lay a claim to them thousands and thousands of years after. And that's where this claimant issue comes in, and where this isn't even political revisionism. This is our take on political correctness, where you don't want to offend people. So you honor their claims. And even if the claims are not historically verifiable or historically accurate, the claims are the claims. So let's consider their claim. If my neighbor came by and said, "This is my house, not your house," I mean, and he's of a certain faith or orientation, and I disclaim his claim, does that mean I'm being politically incorrect by not honoring it? I don't know. But it seems like changing history, changing the Bible, giving credence to precedents that could put people at each other's throats unless political correctness rears its head, this is a dangerous time. At least in Bible times, in Bible terms, it comes down to a battlefield featuring this political correctness versus historical accuracy, and now with biblical correctness, biblical accuracy, and trying to revise that as well, becoming an issue. One faith, and then of course claiming Jesus wasn't Christian or even Jewish, is another issue that's got biblical historians and the Vatican and others rethinking their position in terms of political correctness. It's difficult to overlook the nooks and crannies of a biblical history in and around Jerusalem and Israel. And it's difficult to overlook a lot of this stuff, and especially our own history, which is now taking a little bit of a slant in a different direction. And I can note, and I've read this, and it's verifiable, but I certainly wasn't around, but 1914, 15, 16, during the World War II days, even before we got in it, when Germany became not so well received here, we had a street in Baltimore called German Street. And it's still, the name of the street was changed to Redwood, as the history of the time will tell you. And now it's Redwood, and it's still Redwood. But if you look up the history of Baltimore, you will find out Redwood Street was German Street. And because Germans weren't popular at the time, the street got its name changed. And on a historical note for today's program, this is serious stuff. It's the cornerstone of what we learn in school, what we believe to have happened in our history, and what might change all that in the interest of being less offensive. And I don't know who's offended by what, but it's about changes in language for the good, for the not so good, for political expediency, for protecting groups, for accusing groups. We've come a long way in eliminating profiling, and now in many instances we're back to it, because we're doing reverse profiling in a sense. And here's a little politically correct or incorrect humor before getting into the heart of this. Is con the opposite of pro? Congress is, if con is the opposite of pro, Congress is the opposite of progress. And here's another little tidbit that I came across that I think is hysterical. And it's probably politically incorrect, this kind of humor at this time, in this time and place. But when this is a survey coming out of Washington, an alleged survey coming out of Washington, when asked if they'd have sex with Bill Clinton, 86% of the women in D.C. said, not again. And I thought that was a great line. Anyway, here's another one, and this is a little bit more elaborate. It's about government, and it's politically incorrect. I will acknowledge it's politically incorrect, but you've got three contractors bidding on a broken White House fence. One's from Chicago, one's from Tennessee, and one's from Minnesota. The one from Tennessee measures the fence, does some calculating, and announces to the White House rep the price will be $900, $400 for materials, $400 for workers, and $100 for himself. The one from Minnesota measures the fence and informs the White House official it'll be $700, $300 for materials, $300 for workers, and $100 for himself. The one from Chicago measures the fence, and he scribbles some numbers on a piece of paper, lets the White House guy know the price is $2,700. And $2,700, and the White House guy's astounded that the $700, $900, $2,700. He wants to know where the guy got $2,700, and the guy responds, how did you add the guy? The guy's trying to, he's trying to make some. He says 1,000 for you. He says to the guy in the White House, 1,000 for you, 1,000 for me, and 1,000 for the guy who said 700. Let him do the work. And the White House guy replies, done. And this is how a new stimulus plan is put in place, according to the little humor here. But before all this, when I first became aware there were arguments about history, it wasn't simply the regurgitate. It was. And this was history as I learned it. And I had teachers in high school, and 1776, War of 1812, Civil War dates, the people, the generals, the events, the battles. I had an instructor at Hopkins, an American history instructor at Hopkins who taught maps. I had one who taught Civil War letters. I had one who taught maps. And you'd get a test where the map would say, it was a map of European history. And the map would say, you get a blank map, and that was the test. And the guy would have 10 little places on the map where the question on the test was, where's Leipzig? or where's this or where's that. Anyway, so that was the way it was taught to me. Learn places, learn people, learn events. And it was pretty much history as fact. Then, somewhere along the line, I had a history course at a place in upstate New York called Bard College, and I remember the history instructor. His name was Fred Crane. Fred Crane was a wonderful man. Loved Fred Crane. He was the kindest man in the world, but he had a glitch as a professor of history. He was what was commonly known at the time as I guess he was an economic historian or even a Marxist historian, but he saw all history as coming from money. And he taught history as coming from money. And he did a funny little thing in class. The classes were small. There were maybe 10 people, 8 people in the class. My take was I came right out of history is. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys. And I'm sitting in Fred Crane's class. And later he summed up on a report, and they wrote little reports along with their grades. And he said he appreciates my passion and my patriotism, but that's not what that course was about, because every time you got a little crazy and said, no, we were the good guys, the British were the bad guys, he would wave a little flag at you, a little American flag at you, and tell you that's not the way it worked, because his take on this was, the Revolutionary War in particular, was, and I heard this in other classes too later, he was a revisionist historian. He said it wasn't what we learned, and it was more or less that the wealthy people, the powerful people, the slave owners, the ship owners, the landowners wanted the British out because they were cutting into the profit margin here, and if we get rid of them, they're going to make more money themselves. So get the peasants upset about the British, lead the peasants into the war, stand back, watch it, hope we win, and get rid of the British. And we had all the pieces in place for that at the time. And then Fred Crane also said, and I never forgot that, Fred Crane said, if you want to learn what really happened, you never see, at least on this side of the ocean, you never see the loser side. But you want to find out what happened, go over to Britain and read the loser side. And you'll get an entirely different perspective, because his take was that the British here, prior to the 1770s, the British here were rather benevolent. They weren't really terrible. They weren't really terrible. They were distant. They were virtually invisible as far as he understood it. But somebody needed to get rid of them and stirred up people to get rid of them. And then we had other historians. At this Bard College, we had historians who believed the great man theory of history. In other words, men make history, or does history make men? You could answer that too. And that was part of it. And you had theories, events-based historians, where it was believed that the Lusitania, the sinking of our ships, got us into World War I, and not necessarily the Germans, but the acts against us by the Germans. And there was another theory on World War I that was very prominent at the time, and it was that up until Wilson got us into that war, this is revisionist history too, whether the Germans were the bad guys or not, it was pretty much a crapshoot whether we were going to go to war with the British or against the British, until the British outmarketed the Germans. After some of our ships were sunk, including the Lusitania, the British did a tremendous PR campaign here to convince us the Germans were the bad guys, when nobody was anything then, as it was understood here up until that point. And then they riled everybody up, and everybody said the Germans got to go. And that was World War I. Then World War II, and I want to talk about and this great man theory of history, and I want to recommend a book, of course. And to my mind, the best book that came out of World War II was a book, and this is a great man theory of history too, I guess. There was a book by a French writer, André Schwarzbart, called The Last of the Just. And in Jewish lore, we have allotted to us by the Almighty 39 just men over the course of our entire history. And this particular one, during World War II, taking care, an average man in these circumstances, taking care of his people, offering them solace in the concentration camp, was The Last of the Just. And it's a wonderful book. It was written originally in French, but it doesn't matter. The translation is absolutely magnificent. And that's maybe a great man theory of history, too. But he was a great man designated by God. 39, and he was the last one. And then the book goes over different periods in history when other just men led the people, gave the people what they needed to get through that time. And thousands of years of history and 39 just men. And that was I thought that was an amazing piece of history. And then, of course, at Bard College, you have the great man theory of history. Who are the great men? And then you've got revisionism about the great men and how great were the great men. Because there's a lot of that going on now, too, where you're taking people that we assumed were our heroes and you're looking at them as if they weren't so heroic after all. So the Revolutionary War, and I've got Fred Crane teaching that we weren't the best of it, and the British weren't the worst of it. And then I've got other things going on here about that. And I'm moving along here, and I'm thinking about Lincoln revisionists. Lincoln, and everybody, of course, knows that Lincoln was Lincoln our greatest president? And now you've got, of course, the Lincoln revisionists teaching that and everybody knows this, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anybody, but the counter theory is not complementary to Lincoln, is that it is ensured, if he put that out, it ensured at least his presidency over half the Union, and it pretty well guaranteed a war. And that war, and then Lincoln was, and according to this Bard College professor and others I've had, Lincoln was wily, shrewd, and calculating, and was hardly the great emancipator. And that was a shocker to me, because I never questioned Lincoln. I never questioned Lincoln's intentions. I never questioned the good of Lincoln. But we learn that there are people that are iconic that are also questionable too in history, and then we start with our revisionism, and now we've reached full cycle, and we're coming up to political correctness, which changes the game again. Anyway, the Civil War. Then of course the latest thing out, and this I've heard this over the years, and I've heard this in classes. The Civil War wasn't about slavery; it was about economics. It was about cotton, and it runs counter to and then you've got now you've got, and I read this the other day, and this was kind of a shocker to me, because it can't. I've seen it over the years, and I've seen articles on it, and I've seen suggestions about it, and I've thought about it. But the United Nations is proposing reparations for the those that can prove that they had slavery in their past, in their family's past. Reparations, and whether reparations are feasible, my take is give everybody who can prove it a college scholarship. At least that's something, and it's worth something. But you're not going to break the bank on reparations, and that would be at least a solution to pay as a payback. And it's been a while, but and how do you prove? I guess you can prove it. I don't know, but reparations are an issue. The UN says reparations. The UN says reparations, and but is it politically incorrect to suggest it can't happen? I'm not sure about that. Then there's Spielberg's film, which I did show in a history class, Lincoln and the 13th Amendment, and how Lincoln, if this is historically verifiable. The South was at the gates of Washington waiting to meet with Lincoln to end the war. Lincoln is fighting with Congress over passing the 13th Amendment, the anti-slavery amendment, and he can't get the bill through. And if he knows if the war is over before the 13th Amendment is passed, everybody goes home, the war is for nothing, and they still have slavery. So he's holding up on the end of the war. And he's keeping the people out of Washington, and he's answering questions from Congress about, aren't they there and don't they want to end the war? He says, I have no information on that. They aren't in Washington, to my knowledge. And he's ordered them to be kept out of Washington at the time, out of the Capitol at the time. And that isn't, so this is a Lincoln who's going around to different people in Congress and promising them jobs and threatening them and telling them they'll never do this and they'll do that, and what do you want? And he's making deals, and he's checking his numbers, and he's saying, have we got enough to get this 13th Amendment passed? And then, of course, the popularity of Lincoln was something in question too. Then World War II, World War I wasn't what we thought it was. And I mentioned the Germans sinking our ships, the British marketing it, and that was World War I. And then, of course, we got into it late, and it was over. And then there was, 1918 to 1940, 1939, 1940. And then the Germans were back again. And even when that peace treaty, when that alleged treaty was signed, that surrender treaty was signed, people were saying that'll never hold them. And that was something that we had to live with. And then, of course, the Japanese got into it. And what about Pearl Harbor? Pearl Harbor, our day of our day of infamy, Roosevelt's day of infamy. And it's rumored the British knew they were coming, and they wanted us in the war, so they weren't going to tell us that the Japanese were on the way to bomb Pearl Harbor. And then it's mentioned in another context, and what I learned in the 50s and 60s, being in this school in upstate New York for however brief a period of time. I didn't graduate from that school. I came home, had some other things to do, and then went back to college later and finished. But even there was, in that area of upstate New York, there were something called patroon ships. And they were the early Dutch settlers. And one of those patroon ships, the Van Rensselaers, one of those was the Roosevelt estate. And the Roosevelt estate had a library under guard. And Roosevelt's notes and Roosevelt's diaries from pre-World War II into World War II were kept in that library under guard 24 hours a day for the rest of time. Nobody was ever going to read what Roosevelt knew about the Japanese in Pearl Harbor. And the question, of course, when you can't read it and you can't research it, and this was years and years ago, but still, I don't know if anybody ever got near that library and opened up those books. But you ask yourself at that point in time, if you can't get to the source, what are they hiding? And did we know the Japanese were coming? And was it absolutely necessary in our isolationist mode at the time to have an incident like this to get us into war? And then on 9/11, where Bush said before, and it was well publicized, Bush said before to his minions, get me in a war, I don't want to be a one-termer. And then 9/11 came, and Bush declared war on Iraq, and these people weren't Iraqis. And then later, with the second war, and it became common knowledge that we didn't have to be fighting in Iraq. We fought in Iraq for oil. At least that's what everybody seemed to think. And this wasn't something we had to do. So our 9/11 became that generation's December the 7th, 1941, where somebody wanted us in a war. And in all of this, you learn we aren't always the good guys, maybe never. And then there's Vietnam, where we definitely weren't the good guys. And that was one of the really wasteful efforts we ever had. 50,000 Americans died in Vietnam. And how do you teach that? How do you teach Korea? How do you teach Afghanistan? How do you teach Iraq? And what do you have? And the only accurate assessment we seem to be having was here. We had Ali the Boxer, we had Draft Dodgers, we had folk music, we had the Berrigans, Phil and Daniel, we had the civil rights activists and all that. And this seemed to be something that was recorded history, but it wasn't about the war, which was, Vietnam particularly, was a terrible war. And Iraq, the two Iraqi wars were terrible wars. And what are we doing there? And then I remember, and the first time I ever heard this was at Hopkins, where the guy with the professor with his maps, and his lipstick. Where's lipstick? This guy says, and then I've heard it dozens of times afterward. He said it, and I jumped up when he said it because it rang a bell. He said, World War II was the last war when God was on our side. And if you remember hearing that, I heard that, I guess, in the 1960s. So realistically, what are we doing? And you ask yourself, what are we doing in Vietnam? What are we doing thousands of miles away? Vietnam presented no threat. And there's our president going over there to apologize for this at this time and place, while we claim we're at risk. And we're fighting over there. And what are we at risk of while we're fighting over there? And we're losing people, and we're losing credibility, and we're extending this war, and we're bombing Cambodia, and we're bombing Laos, and then the soldiers come back, and everybody blames the soldiers, and it's one of the black marks in our history. And then the question becomes, how do you teach this? How do you teach children we're not the good guys? Because our history's always been we're the good guys, and this is something that I as a teacher, I taught history. I've taught a little history. I taught history a couple of years ago, and the textbook didn't have anything in it that seemed to have any substance at all. It was a milquetoast textbook. I just junked the textbook. But then you've got something else going on now, and this to me very closely, and I don't know whether I'm being politically incorrect here, but you're asking yourself here, is Syria, what's going on in Syria? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys in Syria? Certainly that dictator is not a good guy. 300,000 people and counting are dead. Who's in the right here? And everybody's piling in, and everybody's testing their weapons, and everybody's seeming to arm one side or the other, but nobody knows which side, and there may be a half a dozen sides, and they're all together, and nobody knows who's what, or who are the good guys, or who should be armed. And there's it seems there are some nations arming more than arming contradictory sides, and this is strange too. And I parallel this strongly with Spain. In pre-World War II days, Spain was their trial battlefield. Everybody had a hand in that conflict. Everybody had something. It was like a testing ground. Let's see what'll work in the big war that we can put in the smaller war. So Spain was ripped to shreds by a war that's very similar, if I'm not being politically correct here, but a very similar to a war that everybody seems to be trying out in Syria. And it's all very confusing. And again, how do you teach this? How do you teach children in history classes about World War II? And how do you teach kids that Germany and Japan were the enemy? Now Germany and Japan are our friends, and Russia and China were our friends then, and now Russia and China aren't so favorably inclined toward us now. And how do you teach kids that? I mean, you've got, there's no simple solution to teaching. And what about the Middle East? Who are our friends in the Middle East? We're juggling friends and enemies in the Middle East. How do you teach kids if in a legitimate world history class, and we had, at Bard College, we had Western civilization, we had history, I guess generic history, we had American history. But how do you teach kids? Revisionist history, Japan, this, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We apologized for that. Now all of a sudden, where Truman, of course, and people after Truman justified that and said there was no way to avoid bombing Nagasaki and Hiroshima. 400,000, 500,000 people were killed, but we may have lost 1 million soldiers if we had to invade and conquer that way. So how do you explain Hiroshima now that we're apologizing for it? And I always had reservations about that. I always thought one bomb would have done it. I didn't know if we needed a second bomb. And who knows about that? Except that Truman justified it. Truman said it was necessary, and the people who did it said it was necessary, and it ended the war and saved lives here. And how do you teach the kids now? If somebody says, if a child in a 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, 11th grade class says, understand the president apologized for World War II. Weren't we the good guys? How do you answer that? Now is where politically correct gets into the marketplace. It's politically correct to make friends with our friends, the great car manufacturers. And by the way, about car manufacturers, and so much of our business is being done with Japan. But and this is a great truth that I guess it's politically correct to ignore it, but one of the great car manufacturers in the world was a car launched by Hitler. And another great car manufacturer in the world was the the corporation that made concentration camp gas chambers. And when the Allies liberated the gas chambers, the name of that company was on the gas chambers. And then you've got Hitler's Mein Kampf is making a comeback. His My Life book, his biography, his autobiography is making a comeback. It's a bestseller. And people now they're doing something. I don't know how they're doing it. This isn't revisionism, but they're saying Hitler wasn't bad. And then another great company here, a wonderful one of our staples, one of our great industries in terms of office machinery, was developing in the 30s and into the 40s, was developing calculators, and Germany ordered them to train the Germans in the use of these calculators so they could track the populations in their death camps. We got 2 million of these, we got 1 million of these, we got 500,000 of these. So this was one of our great companies now. And when they were called on it within a few years ago, their take was that was them, that was the German end, that was the European end of the business, and nobody's left from there to now, and it's forgivable. But is it forgivable? Are war criminals forgivable? Are industries forgivable? And it's well known that Henry Ford was a virulent anti-Semite and very much a follower and an admirer of Hitler. And in fact, in Mein Kampf, Henry Ford was the only American mentioned favorably in Mein Kampf when Hitler wrote his book at the time. Anyway, we've established a lot of things here about money and Vietnam and maybe Freddie Crane. Fred Crane wasn't so far afield when he said history is about money and history is about making money. And how do you teach history in the do you want to teach history in the context of the truth? Is this the truth that the people who make the money are making the history? It's not necessarily the great people. And is it politically correct to attribute history to money, to power, to people who can pull strings, who can push buttons, who can make the history happen? And then there's Trump flying in the face of political correctness and historical revisionism by hyping our greatness. Trump's saying we're great. I'd like to think we're still great. And when we're in an apologist mode, and we're apologizing for our history, and we're trying, and it's very confusing. I would imagine in classrooms it's very confusing for the kids to come in and say, I understand we apologized for this. I thought we were the good guys here again. And this goes on. And this, to me, is a generational mistake, because I learned history a certain way. The children are learning history a different way. And in between, I tried to teach it in some middle ground fashion that didn't work either way. And I don't understand it. I took a look at that textbook. I was teaching a course 2 years ago. I was teaching a course in a tech school, an American history course in a tech school. And they were 3-hour sessions. And I'm looking at the textbook, and the textbook isn't making any sense to me because it's watered down the bad. It's before we started becoming an apologist, but it's watered things down, and I don't understand. I junked the textbook, and I just did it in terms of, I had some old news clips and some other things, and did it in terms of what should we be remembering about this, and how can we process the contradictions here. And so we remain uncertain whether this nation is the good guys, revisionist-wise, or the not-so-good guys anymore. And what about political correctness? Let's go into political correctness. Internationally, historically accurate. Do we go with historically accurate, or are we committing and building a divisiveness between ourselves and academia on this note? And at least mercifully, I hope we can make historical peace rather than have to change things over and do some other things to make sense to children. How do you teach this? I'd love to talk to people who teach history or history majors and figure out how they're doing this. And I actually used an article. An article came to my attention, and it was it probably was 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 5 years ago, and it was at the height of we're in Iraq, we're getting out of Iraq, Iraq's problematic, Iraq's this, Iraq's that, And the kids were coming home from schools, and they were hearing in schools, or they were hearing from other kids who heard from their parents that Iraq is bad. It's a bad place. We shouldn't be there. And they were coming home and they were asking their parents, why are we in Iraq? And the parents had to explain our bad guy role rather than our good guy role. And it became very confusing to children. And this article was based on, what do you tell a child about a war when suddenly your country is in question? And this is a very, very difficult thing to do. Both Iraqi conflagrations weren't popular, and the children have to be told. If the children can absolutely frame a question that directly, you can't avoid the question. It's almost like, where do babies come from? I mean, why were we in it? Why were soldiers needlessly dying? What were we spending? And then I'm of course I'm a generation that can't explain Grenada, the island. What are we doing fighting an island? It's like a college football game between Ohio State or Oklahoma is playing New Paltz State Teachers College from upstate New York. What are we doing in Grenada? Why are we in Grenada? That was one of my really strange ones. I never knew Grenada. What are we doing in Afghanistan? I never knew Afghanistan. I had students who came back from Afghanistan and came back from that part of the world, and they didn't know. They were in the military, and they didn't know what they were doing there. And they didn't know who the good guys and the bad guys were there and who we were supporting and who we weren't supporting. And academia. Now, so you've got academia struggling to teach history and struggling to teach current events and struggling to teach world politics and struggling to teach this. And you've got other areas of our culture determining what is preferable as an explanation. And my contention is that political correctness is not a good thing. It's destroyed any semblance of history as part of our necessary fund of knowledge. And I have to laugh and I'm thinking about this because political correctness seems to be a salve that saves people from the slings and arrows. But somebody says, and nobody's protecting, and to my mind, I'm Jewish. I don't hear anybody standing up and saying, you can't say that about Jews. But somebody says anti-Semitism is the last politically correct form of bigotry. So we've got that, and I have to laugh at that, and especially the Holocaust deniers. And they're even in some instances, they're power in England, in France, they're power brokers. They're leaders, and they're saying it didn't happen. And thousands of books, thousands of witnesses, thousands of survivors, it didn't happen. Concentration camps, 6 million people dead, it didn't happen. Well, it's history. And and I've talked to people who were survivors, and I wonder about how anybody can accept that somebody in a position of authority can say it didn't happen and not question it. And I don't see people questioning the deniers. And I don't know, because the deniers are offended if you question their denial. What a spin we've spun here. And there are American writers who are writing history, and they've got problems. John Jakes is one, and John Jakes is one of our great history writers. I always believe John Jakes. He wrote North and South and some other things. And John Jakes gives us living history through fictional events and characters and real events and characters. And then I've got one here I'm extremely impressed with that I just found, and I didn't know who this guy was. And then I started researching political correctness and history. And you know, in his historical accuracy, and there's a guy named David Bowles. And Bowles is, by every measure, he writes about the West, he writes about Native Americans, he writes this kind of stuff. And by every measure, this is a fair-minded, thoughtful, talented man with a field of study. And he's written these books. And now he's got a problem. And his problem isn't writing these books. He's trying to be historically accurate. He's writing about 200 years ago, and he's writing about the West, and he's writing about Native Americans. He doesn't call them Native Americans because nobody called them Native Americans then. And he says one of his problems was, and he heard this, because people were offended. And he's writing about a meeting, and I think it was in 1780, with a Cherokee chief. and he references his wife as a squaw, and people are offended. And he asks in his essay on this, when he's explaining this, he says, "What do I do? Do I use the language of the time as an accurate depiction, or do I, in some way, whitewash the language in order to not offend anybody?" And he's as direct as you can get with this, because his entire orientation is accuracy. And then he says, as a little addendum item to this, he runs into a woman from India, and he calls her an Indian, and she says, no, an Indian is a Native American. I'm not an Indian. And then we have, in our own family, we have a relative from Ghana who's married into the family, and he says he's the real African American. And he's a United States citizen, and he's been here for a while. And he says the difference in orientation between African American Americans and African Americans is remarkable, because aside from apartheid, they have little identification with our history, and no identification with the issues that African Americans are venting about currently. And he feels like there isn't any meeting of the minds between these two either, even though he recognizes that in certain situations he can be identified as them. But he is an American African American. He is not an American African American. He's an African American. And in a way, and this is a very bright guy, he's historically very astute. He speaks a half a dozen languages. He does different things. He's got a lot of skill sets. And he finished high school, actually finished high school at 12, and finished college early there. And so he's kind of a de Tocqueville in his worldview of us. He separated himself from it, but he sees himself becoming a potential victim of it as well. Then there's this Bowles again, David Bowles, and Traps, Trials, and Tribulations in his genre, and he leaves his concern open-ended and asks his readers to fill in the blanks and tell him what he can do right and wrong if he's going to write about this particular subject area, the West. And what's he going to call people in the West if the language isn't right? And then as an addendum to this, Charles Dickens was accused of anti-Semitism. Dickens' Oliver Twist had Fagin, one of the most hideous figures in literature. And Fagin was a mentor to the street urchins and the thieves, and Fagin was almost a Jewish caricature. And so Dickens, when somebody said, "Are you anti-Semitic?" And Dickens said, "No, I'm not anti-Semitic. I am painting a picture of the way I understood the British in my time and place saw Jews." And then even that Fagin character. Later there was a Nazi journal called Der Stürmer, where the cartoons were of characters that looked like Fagin. Anyway, back to the Native American issue. This is a Native American issue too, but who knows this? The Redskins, the Washington Redskins, the football team, and I've talked about this before, there's a huge hue and cry to get that name out of there and to call them something else. And the St. John's, I think the St. John's basketball team, I mentioned this in a sports broadcast, they were called the Redskins, and then they became the Red Storm, and that's better. I guess that's more politically correct. So anyway, Western movies. And Native Americans in Western movies, in the mountains, on the desert, in the settlements, the forts, the towns. The Native Americans were a threat to everybody, and the directors and the producers of these early movies made them a significant issue. If there's nothing else going on, let's send the Native American, let's send the Indian, the Native American into town, and he'll come back. And he'll come back in big trouble because nobody wants him in that town. And then Daniel Boone, and there are Daniel Boone reruns running, the Fess Parker Daniel Boone reruns, where one of his pals is Mingo, who is he's a Native American, but he went to Oxford, which just changes the profile. And he comes back, and he can quote Shakespeare, and he can do anything because he's an Oxford scholar dressed as a Native American. And he runs around with Daniel Boone, and nobody questions him because he's Mingo. And he's got college degrees from Oxford. Anyway, and good for Fess Parker for doing this. Bad for Tonto, the Lone Ranger character, because that was the worst. That was the worst stereotype of all. And if anything, that should be replaced or revised or something. Then you've got Johnny Depp in the very bad Lone Ranger movie, where Johnny Depp is absolutely giving it to the Lone Ranger and making a complete fool out of him, because Johnny Depp, the Tonto character, is much smarter than the Lone Ranger in terms of what to do now and what to do later. Anyway, Native Americans in those early movies speak a bizarre, and those early TV shows speak a bizarre broken English, and that's a terrible thing too. And they're always being abused. And nobody ever feels sorry for them, because the mobs and the settlers and the this and the that and the troops are always after them, and they always do stupid things, like they ride around in circles around the wagon train until there's nobody left but about 3 of them, and then they drive, and they all got shot, and they drive off, and somebody signals and they take off, and then the settlers who lost nobody I feel like that's a victory. I don't think it's a victory. I think it's kind of a disgusting scene when you see that, when they're riding around. And then there's I'm not an Errol Flynn fan. Errol Flynn was very pro-Hitler, very pro-Nazi, but Errol Flynn was a hero in our movies. English, he was a hero in our movies, and he played in a lot of westerns, and he was Custer, but his Custer was wasn't a pathetic West Point graduate, but a courageous officer leading his troops against the tribes, sworn to destroy them, and everybody gets killed. And there are later versions of this where the Black Hills have gold, and of course the gold seekers are in the Black Hills, and there goes Custer to get rid of the Indians. So you can go look for gold in the Black Hills and get rid of the Indians and break the treaty. And I tend to less believe the Errol Flynn version of Custer, and more the story of the greed-driven, gold-mad prospectors as more historically accurate, even if it isn't politically correct. I don't know what is. Historical accuracy would suggest we commit an attempted genocide against the Indians, but political correctness would suggest we never were the bad guys in this part of our history, and that's something to correct, certainly something to correct. And advocates for a Native American population are running a public service announcement now that's getting some attention, and I feel sorry for them, because it's a bad public service announcement, and all it's saying is that the indigenous larger population is trying to destroy their culture by taking the children and mainstreaming them, and they're losing their heritage, they're losing their history in this process of assimilation, and that's the spot. And they want to be spared so they can still teach the culture that was theirs in another time, even though they've lost everything else. And but there was, and it's not a good spot, because it doesn't ring a bell. And the spots where the save the animals, save the children, those spots get more attention. This spot, it just kind of, it's like blowing warm air through your head. Who cares whether they have a culture, or whether their culture is being preserved, or whether their culture is being lost in a greater society that's trying to eliminate that too. And it's a question to think about. But there was a wonderful, wonderful spot that never to be forgotten. It's one of the great public service announcements of all time, and anybody who ever saw it. You've got this venerable, old, wrinkled chief in a canoe coming down the river. And you get close-ups of his face, and all the history is in his face. And he rows the canoe over to the shore, and he's fierce, he's stoic, he's Spartan, and he looks at the trash dumped on the ground near the riverbank, and tears pour out of his eyes, and down his cheeks. And you get the face, and the face is the full screen is the face. And then the voiceover says, in this very, very poignant way, some of us have a great respect for the land, and some of us do not. And it's a wonderful spot. That meant more to me as a spot than the spot about the culture. Everything anyway. And we've got some things around here I can mention too, where we get trash dumped on our lawn. and you can't do anything about that either. And I always want to think, when I see there's trash on our hill because there are kids riding by, and they don't want to get caught with beer cans or liquor bottles in their cars and trucks. So they throw the trash out on our lawn, on our hillside, and we've got trees growing so we can't see it. And then when I walk down there toward the hill, I see all the trash, and I pick up a bag of trash about once a week. And I'm thinking as I'm picking up that trash, some of us have a great respect for the land, and some do not. Anyway, breaking from this, is it too little too late to get our history back to a point where we can get something accurate in it and still not be offensive? And that's where we are with this. And we've got writers. We got writers who are and one of the schools of writing in our literature, great schools of writing, is Southern writers. And Southern writers and other writers, Twain got away with it. Mark Twain got away with it in Mississippi because he was writing from the perspective of Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. Alice in Wonderland and Gulliver's Travels were children's fiction that took a swipe at England and got away with it because they were children's fiction. But we've got, in our history, in our literature, we've got a whole Twain, Faulkner, O'Connor, Ernest Gaines, Carson McCullers, Tennessee Williams, Margaret Mitchell, Harper Lee, Zora Houston, Maya Angelou, John Grisham, Robert Penn Warren, Alex Haley, William Styron, Cormac McCarthy, John Jakes, James Dickey, Erskine Caldwell, Eudora Welty, Toni Morrison, Michael Charest, and others. And it's more than fiction, but they're not politically correct. And at some point in time, will political correct overwhelm our literature to the point where these books, and even we had an incident. Earlier, I remember during my days in the school system, Catcher in the Rye couldn't be read in schools because adults were scared of it. Claude Brown's classic Man Child in the Promised Land was out and out banned, and it was the first great street novel. And the school board and somebody named Maria Faring in the school board did not want Man Child in the Promised Land anywhere near those children. But it's a brilliant book. It's a classic. The language is rough, but it's a classic. Anyway, so what do you do about writers? What do you do about ratings? What do you do about any of this? Anyway, and in this instance, I'm recalling in our Baltimore area, in Owings Mills, in Baltimore County, the kids actually rehearsed to do To Kill a Mockingbird in a theatrical presentation, and the principal had never read To Kill a Mockingbird, but she took a look at the script, saw the language, and said they can't do it. It's not politically correct to say this, say that, call them this, call them that. So they did Our Town. And the principal was roasted in the local paper because it was making the rounds. And in a lot of instances, the kids were actually doing To Kill a Mockingbird as a play. And it had come out as a play in a play form for high schools to do. So anyway, wrapping this up now, I want to talk about... okay. I've got something here I think I can talk about that's really all right. Here, this I'll end it on this note. And a little boy here. There's a little boy here, and it's a little anecdotal story. And the little boy wants to know about politics, and the father, he's a purist. And he's trying to explain to the little boy that he's the breadwinner, the mother's the administrator who deals with the money matters, and call her the government. And both parents are responsible for taking care of the little child, the baby, and they have a nanny who's the working class. So the little boy mulls on that and goes to bed thinking about it. And then he doesn't really understand all of that. And later that night, he hears his little brother crying. So he goes in to check on him, discovers the baby soiled his diaper. He goes to his mother's bedroom and finds she's sleeping. And he doesn't want to wake her, and he wonders where his father's going off to. So he checks the nanny's room, and the door's locked, and he looks through the keyhole, and he sees the father in bed with the nanny. The next morning at breakfast, he announces to everybody he understands about politics as his father described it. And the father thinks this is a major communications victory, so he asks the boy to tell him what he's come to understand about all of this based on what they talked about. And the little boy says, well, capitalism is screwing the working class, and the government is sound asleep. The future is in deep shit. Anyway, on that note, I'll end this, and I wish you well this week. And think about your language. Think about your language as it applies to history. Think about whether your language is offensive to anybody. And think about whether your depiction is accurate and whether your thoughts are accurate in terms of what you know about where you've come from and where your history is and how your history might have changed in the process. And I thank you very much for this week, and I'll be back with you again next week with another segment of In and Out of Focus. Bye.